King and pawn endgames are some of the most frequently occurring endgames that there are, and there's a couple techniques that you need to know in order to guarantee that you get a draw when you have one, or convert your winning position. One of these techniques is called opposition. So in opposition, it's when the two kings are on the same color square, and if you draw a box between them, all four corners of the box are also the same color square. So it's a little bit hard to illustrate in this position, but here you can see that we do have opposition. Let me show another position to better show this concept. In this position, for example, there is no opposition. We see that our kings are on the same two color squares. Both kings are on dark squares. However, let's draw the box that I mean. So when we draw a box, we draw a diagonal, and then we connect the corners like this. Right? We have a box now. So if we look at the corners of the box, these two squares here were dark squares, but these two squares are light squares. So since the colors of the corners of the squares don't match, here there is no opposition. However, since it's white to move here, if white plays the move king to e5, then we see that there is opposition, because now when we draw this box like this, we can see that all four squares here are dark squares. Since all four corners of the box are the same color, then in this position we can see that white has opposition. We say that the person has opposition if it's the other side to move. Let me explain how this works. So going back to the position that we started with, first of all, we can determine that this is opposition because the white king and black king are on the same color square, and really the box is just like this. So since all four corners, or really the two corners, are the same color, then we have opposition. So now let's say it was white to move. This means that black has opposition. Why do we say that black has opposition? Because this means that white needs to move somewhere, either this side or this side, and it allows black to make progress. So for example, if white plays king to d3, black can continue blocking white's king from advancing. If white comes back, black can continue blocking white. The point of opposition is that the king is opposing white's king like this by controlling these three squares. White can never reach any of these squares, and therefore he cannot advance his king or make progress. On the other hand, if it was black to move in this position, we can say that white has opposition. Why is white in possession of opposition? Because when black plays his move, for example, if he plays his king here, or any of these squares for that matter, say he goes here, he lets white get this square for his king. Remember that here, black controlled the squares d4, e4, and f4. However, after he makes the move of king to d5, he can only control these three squares, but not this one. So here, white is able to play the move king to f4, advancing his king, which then allows his pawn to advance later on. Now, opposition can be pretty important in king-pawn endgames, because now we can see that sometimes just the opposition, or whoever has it, can determine which side would win the game. So if we look at this position right now, so if it's white to move, I would say that white can win the game. How do we know that? Well, white's first move is king to d4. We play king to d4 because we want to get in front of the pawn, so we want to put our king in front of the pawn to support the pawn to promotion. And then, after putting the king in front of the pawn, we can use the fact that we have opposition to continue advancing our king. So for example, after king to d4, if black moves his king away, then we can get our king up in front even further. If black comes back, then once again white can give opposition and play king to d5. So once again white has the opposition, and if black moves away anywhere, once again white's king can continue advancing. So if we continue repeating this process, eventually white will be able to play king to e7, where then the pawn can come down and promote. So for example, if d4, after king to c6, if he tries to stop this, white can play just king e6. And after king to c7, later on d5, and king d8, white can once again have the opposition with king to d6. And now, once again, black is forced to make his move with his king, either king to e8 or king to c8. If he goes king to e8, then we can play king to c7, and then we can promote our pawn like this. So king to c7, if king e7, then d6 check, king e8, followed by d8 queening. So pretty much if we look back at this position, we can see that there's opposition here with king to d4. If white gets the opposition, then he'll be able to win. However, if he makes a mistake here and plays something like king to e4, then black has the opposition after king to e6. So now if white plays something like king to d4, black can continue blockading white's king by controlling these three squares in front of it. White can continue playing like this, but he will never make any progress. So eventually white's going to give up and start just pushing his pawns. The problem is, if white wants to win this game, his king must be in front of his pawn to support it. If the king is behind the pawn, then it cannot help the pawn promote, and the game will eventually become a draw. So here we see that the king is not in front of the pawn. So since the king is not in front of the pawn, it's going to be much easier for black to defend. Simply here, black can play the move king to d6, putting his king directly in front of the pawn now. We don't really need to worry about opposition because white isn't going to play over here. If white continues to push, the key here for black is that if you can't keep his king on d6, he needs to move directly backwards. So for example, king to d7. Now white can continue trying to advance by using his king to control this square, so his pawn can come to d6. Here, black needs to get the opposition with king to c7, right? We don't want to play something like king to d8, which allows white to get the opposition with king to d6. So black plays king to c7, getting the opposition with white's king, and white might play something like d6 to continue moving his pawn. The key here is that black puts his king directly in front of the pawn now, and white here is forced to do a waiting move, king to d5, so that black's king is forced to come back to d8. Once again, it's very important that we come back to d8. If we go to d8, there's no way white can get opposition here. However, if we play something like king to c8, then if king to c6, king to d8, now d7, king e7, white can promote. So it's very important to make sure that white does not have the opposition after you make your move. So after king to d8, white has two choices here. He can play king e6 or king c6 in order to advance his pawn. Let's say he plays king e6. Then, once again, it's very important for black to get the opposition here. We play king to e8. Once again, the king can't come to any of these three squares. And if he plays the move d7, king d8, white is either forced to give stalemate here, or he'll have to play somewhere one of these squares, which gives up the pawn on d7. Now you might be wondering here that why doesn't white play something like king to f4 if that also gets the opposition, right? So if we draw our box here, well, look at that. We have opposition as well. And all four squares here are dark squares, of course. Well, the answer here is that if you play king to f4, you're actually getting a little bit too far from your pawn. So right now, if you play king to f4, you're not stopping black's king from coming towards your pawn, whereas king to d4 did. So black can actually play the move king to e5 here. And of course, you can continue with the opposition, king to f5, but that doesn't really do anything to help your pawn advance. In fact, black can actually play king to d4 and win your pawn immediately. So it's best to find the opposition which is in front of your pawn on one of these files, the two files next to your pawn or the file that your pawn is on. Similarly, after king to d4, if black plays something like king to c6 and king to e5, why does black play king to d7 instead of something like king to c7 or king to c5, both of which get the opposition? So if you want to think about why black chooses to play king to d7, you can pause your video. Okay, so black plays king to d7 mainly to keep his king in front of the pawn. If you play something like king to c5, okay, sure, he does get the opposition, but he's not doing anything to stop the king's progress or the pawn's. So we can just play the move d4. And after king to c6, king to e6, now white just continues pushing his pawn. And black doesn't really have any good way to stop this, so he might play king to c7 and d5. But eventually he'll either be forced to give up king to d7, followed by d6, d7, d8, queen, or he'll have to play the move king to d8, where then white can get opposition with king to d6, transposing to what we saw in the game. So black plays king to d7 in order to get in front of the pawn. Of course, he can get opposition, but his opposition here isn't exactly meaningful, and he would much rather prevent the pawn from promoting instead. Now, before we proceed on to the next example, I just want to give a little bit of warning. Right now, the positions that we're looking at involve a lot of pawn and king endgame theory. So if you're not so familiar with how to promote a king or a pawn with just a king here, don't worry. You can look at either this video, or you can use other resources in the book and the key square section to help you learn how to promote your pawn with only a king. So we have another example here. It's white to move. And it seems like white should be in a pretty good position. It looks like white will be able to win one of these pawns, hopefully. And if he does win the pawn, then it seems like he should have a winning position. So the easiest way that I see for white to win the pawn is to start immediately attacking it. So if he plays the move king to d7, then it seems like, okay, this pawn, if he defends it with king to f6, simply king to d6 is a waiting move. And if king to f7, then e5, black is forced to give up the pawn. And if he plays e5, then king to d5, and black is once again forced to give up the pawn. So is this the winning move? King to d7, right? It's very simple. We win the pawn, right? Well, not really. If we play king to d7, black can actually give up his pawn. Black can play the pawn to e5. And now, if white plays the move king to d6, black goes king to f7. After king to f7, white can take on e5, but the problem is black swoops in front of the pawn and gives opposition. Right, we have opposition here. So since the pawn here is below the 5th rank, then white cannot win this game. So it turns out that we need to make black's opposition a little bit less meaningful. Instead, the correct move here is to play the move e5. So after e5, if black comes over and defends his pawn, for example, king to f7, then white can come and play something like king to d6, forcing black to make another move with his king and lose the pawn. Of course, black can play the move king to f8, waiting for white to take on e6, and then king to e8, which then gives opposition. However, this is a little bit too late. White can afford to play king to d6, and if king to d8, then he can just advance his pawn, and he can force black's king to come out to f7. After that happens, king d7, then white can promote. Notice that this did not work in the other line, because after king to d7, then e5, then king to d6. So after this, white could not try the same thing, because here, after pushing the pawn, black is now forced to play the move king to f6. Here, black can just directly retreat king to e8. And now after king to d6, king to e8, e7, and king e8, the difference is that in this position, it's actually white to move, and he's forced to give stalemate. However, in the other position, it would be black to move, where black would be forced to get his king out from in front of the pawn. The whole point that black could draw in this line was the fact that he had opposition. Once again, if you're having a little bit of trouble discerning what kind of positions are win for the pawn side and what kind of positions are drawn, I'll be making a flowchart video to help you identify these kind of positions.